After my grandparents raised me, my stepfather decided he deserved their $1 million legacy and would stop at nothing to take it, and growing up, I'd always thought of myself as pretty lucky. My grandparents, Harold and Diane, were the kind of people who'd make you feel safe just by being around them. They took me in when I was 6, after my mom remarried Mark, a man who, let's just say, never exactly warmed up to me. At first, I thought it was normal. Plenty of kids have stepdads they don't click with. But as I got older, I realized that Mark was different. There was always this resentment, like he was annoyed I was even in the picture. But with my grandparents backing me, I could shrug it off. Now, I'm 21, officially an adult, legally able to do just about anything, and, thanks to my grandparents, about to inherit a life-changing sum. My grandparents had always been open with me about the fact that they had something set aside for my future. It was only recently, though, that I found out the amount they'd saved for me. $1 million. I'd been floored when they told me. I knew they were well off, but had no idea it was to this extent. The money was supposed to help me start strong, as they'd put it. It was their way of making up for the shaky start my mom and Mark had given me. I loved my grandparents for that, for always having my back. But apparently, I wasn't the only one paying attention to their generosity. It was maybe a month ago when Mark started showing a strange level of interest in my life. Not the good kind of interest, where you'd think he was genuinely interested in my goals or future. No, Mark's curiosity was laser-focused on one thing: my relationship with Harold and Diane. At first, I brushed it off as him trying to bond, which was odd enough, given we'd never been close. But then he started making these offhand comments, jokes, he called them, about how generous they were and how lucky I was to have them. The first time it struck me as more than just small talk was at a family dinner with my mom, Mark, and me. My grandparents weren't there that night. Mark leaned over the table with a smirk and said, "You know, Caleb, you really should be grateful for what they're leaving you. Some people work their whole lives and never get a slice of that pie." I remember swallowing, my appetite suddenly gone. There was this strange gleam in his eyes, a mixture of envy and entitlement. My mom just looked down at her plate. She had a habit of staying silent whenever Mark went on one of his tangents, which was often, but this time, something felt off. Like he was hinting at something I wasn't picking up on. Then last week, Mark showed up at my place unexpectedly. I live close to my grandparents in a small apartment they helped me rent. It was a humble space, but I liked it that way. Mark hadn't ever bothered to visit before, so his sudden appearance felt jarring. He sauntered in, looking around like he owned the place, and started making small talk about my grandparents. He asked if I'd seen them recently, what kind of conversations we'd been having. His questions were odd, pointed, and it felt like he was fishing for something. I tried to give short answers, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But Mark's persistence was relentless. He started asking if I'd ever thought about what to do with a big inheritance, if I'd considered how to responsibly handle a sum like that. I could tell he was angling at something, and the longer he kept at it, the more I felt this knot of suspicion growing in my gut. Eventually, he cut to the chase. "Look, Caleb, you know your grandparents are getting older. It's just the way life goes, right? They're bound to pass on what they've got to you." He paused, studying me with a faint sneer. "But have you considered that maybe they owe a little of that elsewhere? Like, I don't know, helping your mother and me? We're family too, aren't we?" I didn't know what to say. Sure, we were family, but his tone was anything but familial. It was almost as if he thought he deserved part of the inheritance himself. The audacity of it floored me. "They've always said the money is for me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "They want to make sure I'm set up, that I have the freedom to pursue what I want." His mouth twitched into a thin, humorless smile. "Of course, Caleb. Of course. But you know, it's all about fairness. They helped raise you, but they supported your mother too. A good chunk of their fortune should go to everyone who's been part of their lives." The implication was clear. He was counting himself in that everyone. I was shocked by his nerve, his sense of entitlement. For years, he'd barely acknowledged my grandparents' role in my life. Yet now he was acting as if he were some kind of equal benefactor. After that visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was up to something. I tried talking to my mom about it, but she just brushed it off, saying he was probably just being overly practical. But I knew her well enough to see she was avoiding eye contact, and that told me she was aware of Mark's intentions, whether or not she'd admit it. Over the next few days, things got even stranger. Mark began dropping by my grandparents' house unannounced, supposedly to check up on them. He'd never been a doting son-in-law before, and my grandparents certainly didn't need him to be now. Every time I went over, my grandmother mentioned in passing how Mark had been by again, asking if they needed anything. She seemed as confused by his sudden interest as I was, though she never questioned it out loud. One afternoon, I was having tea with my grandparents, and my grandfather gave me a curious look. "Caleb, my boy," he said, "is everything all right between you and Mark? He's been very attentive lately." His words were cautious, but there was an unspoken question in them. He wasn't oblivious to the tension Mark was stirring up. I hesitated, wondering how much to share. My grandfather had always been my confidant, but I didn't want to worry him if this was all in my head. Still, his concern pushed me to speak up. "Honestly, Grandpa, I think Mark's, well, he's asking a lot about the future. About the inheritance, specifically." Harold nodded slowly, a shadow crossing his face. "I had a feeling," he muttered, looking off into the distance. "People get strange around money, Caleb. They start seeing dollar signs instead of people." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Whatever happens, know that you're our priority. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words stuck with me, but they also sparked a growing sense of dread. It was as if Mark had been waiting for this moment, waiting for my grandparents' age to weaken their defenses. Now, with their health slowing them down, he saw an opening, a chance to grab hold of what he felt he deserved. In the days following, I could feel the walls closing in. Mark's visits increased, and he seemed to be ingratiating himself into every aspect of their lives. He'd even tried convincing them to let him manage some of their finances, a request they thankfully declined. But it was clear to me that he wouldn't be giving up anytime soon. And that's when I realized, if I didn't find a way to protect what my grandparents had entrusted to me, Mark might just succeed in tearing apart everything we'd built. The shadow over our family was growing darker, and it felt like I was the only one who could see it coming. The tension with Mark only seemed to grow sharper as the days passed. I could feel him circling my life like a hawk, just waiting to swoop in. He had this way of getting under my skin, pushing and prodding with comments that seemed harmless on the surface, but I knew what he was doing. He was trying to sow doubt, to make me second-guess everything my grandparents had promised. A few days ago, I was at my grandparents' house for lunch. It had been a rough week at work, and I just wanted to relax, maybe talk to Harold about an upcoming project. He'd always been a sounding board for me, a source of steady wisdom. But as I settled into the cozy kitchen with the familiar smell of fresh-baked cookies filling the air, Mark showed up unannounced. Again, Diane, bless her heart, was polite as always, offering him a seat at the table. He declined, instead hovering by the doorway, watching us with that same calculating look that had become so unsettling. He finally spoke, voice casual but laced with something colder. "You know, Caleb," he started, "your grandparents have given you so much already. A place to live, an education, the support you needed to get on your feet." He paused, his eyes never leaving mine. "Isn't it fair to consider that they might need a bit of support themselves?" I shot him a look, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "They seem to be doing just fine." "Oh, are they?" he replied, smirking slightly. "You know, Caleb, sometimes it's not about what they say but about what they don't say. They're getting older, after all. You might not notice it, but there are things they could use help with. Things that, maybe, you're too busy to handle." His implication was clear. He thought he should be the one managing their lives, not me. It was ridiculous, insulting even, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "Mark, with all due respect, I think my grandparents can make those decisions for themselves. They know I'm here for them," I replied, my voice tense. Harold, who had been watching this exchange with a wary eye, finally spoke up, cutting through the growing tension. "Caleb's right, Mark. We appreciate your concern, but we're just fine." His tone was firm, his gaze steady as he held Mark's stare. But Mark just shrugged, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Harold. I just wanted to make sure you knew I was here, that's all." Then he turned to me, lowering his voice. "Caleb, can I talk to you privately?" I didn't want to, but something told me it was best not to make a scene in front of my grandparents. So, reluctantly, I followed him outside to the porch. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of leaves and the faint hint of wood smoke from a nearby fireplace. I crossed my arms, waiting for whatever nonsense he had prepared this time. "Look," he started, glancing over his shoulder to make sure we were alone. "I know you think you're the golden child here, but let's get real. You've had it easy with them. They've given you everything, haven't they?" I didn't respond, just stared at him, waiting. He continued, his voice dropping even lower. "You think they're just going to hand you everything when they pass? I hate to break it to you, but life isn't that simple, Caleb. They have a duty to consider the rest of the family too. Asterisk my family asterisk," he emphasized. "They owe us just as much as they owe you." There it was again, that entitlement, the blatant greed that he didn't even try to hide anymore. But what shocked me more was the subtle threat in his tone. It wasn't just about sharing. He was making it sound like he deserved it more than I did, as if my years with them didn't mean anything. I gritted my teeth, barely managing to keep my voice steady. "Whatever you think you're owed, Mark, my grandparents know what they're doing, and I trust them to make their own decisions." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "So naive, Caleb. You think because they love you, you're untouchable? People change their minds. Alliances shift. You'd better watch out. You don't want to end up with nothing, do you?" With that, he walked off, leaving me seething. I wanted to shout after him, to let him know that I wasn't afraid of his mind games. But as much as I hated to admit it, his words gnawed at me. I trusted my grandparents, but Mark had a way of twisting things, making people doubt what they thought they knew. I tried talking to my mom again that night, hoping she'd back me up, but when I brought up Mark's behavior, her reaction surprised me. "Caleb," she sighed, "he's just being realistic. You have to understand, he worries about our future. It's not that he doesn't care about you or your grandparents, but he feels a responsibility to make sure we're all okay. You're young. You have plenty of time to build your own life." There was something disheartening about her words, like she was aligning herself with him, even if she didn't mean to. I'd always known that she went along with Mark more often than not, but this was different. It felt like I was losing her, like she was slipping further into his grasp. And worst of all, it made me feel alone, like I was the only one who saw what he was really after. The next day, I decided to have a private conversation with my grandparents. I didn't want to worry them, but I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I told them about Mark's comments, about how he was pushing for control over their lives, their money, everything. They listened intently, Harold's face darkening as I spoke, and Diane clutching her hands together anxiously. "Caleb," my grandfather finally said, his voice low and steady, "you have every right to be concerned. I've noticed his behavior too. But we have things in place to ensure that our wishes are followed, regardless of what Mark wants." It was reassuring to hear that they had a plan, that they weren't as vulnerable as Mark seemed to think. But Harold's expression held a sadness that worried me. "Your grandmother and I have lived a long life, Caleb. We've seen people change when money is involved. It's disappointing to see it in someone we thought we could trust." The words hung in the air, heavy and filled with an unspoken resignation. I realized then that they were as aware of Mark's intentions as I was, but they felt trapped. He was family, after all, and even though they knew his true colors, cutting him off wasn't as simple as I wished it could be. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. Mark was relentless, and I had a sinking feeling that he wouldn't stop until he'd gotten what he wanted, or until he'd completely dismantled the life my grandparents had built for us. A week later, things took a darker turn. I'd gone to visit my grandparents, hoping for a calm afternoon, but Diane seemed distracted, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet anxiety. After some prodding, she finally confessed, "Mark's been trying to convince us to make some changes to our plans. He thinks we should reassess our will." I felt my stomach twist. This was exactly what I'd feared. The man was practically foaming at the mouth to get his hands on their money. Harold, overhearing from the next room, joined us. He looked at me, his eyes tired but resolute. We told him no, of course, but he's been persistent. Keep saying it's for the greater good, that we should think of your mother, of him. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Caleb, I'm sorry you have to go through this. The weight of it all started pressing on me. I couldn't let Mark push my grandparents into a corner like this. I'd have to be vigilant, to keep him from manipulating them or forcing them into a decision they didn't want. The worst part, though, was the creeping realization that I couldn't do this alone, and I didn't know who to turn to. After that conversation with my grandparents, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on me. I'd always been grateful for everything Harold and Diane had done, but now, with Mark prowling around, I knew I had to protect them. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't stay vigilant, Mark would find a way to twist things to his advantage. Over the next couple of days, I did my best to stick close to my grandparents without making it obvious. I helped with errands, drove them to appointments, and tried to stay up to date on anything new they mentioned. But even with my efforts, Mark's visits continued. Sometimes, I'd find him already there when I arrived, hovering around the house like he was staking his claim. One afternoon, I found a quiet moment with my grandmother. I noticed how tired she looked, the lines on her face deeper than they'd been just a few weeks ago. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm, and looked me in the eyes. Caleb, there's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice soft but urgent. We've made some changes to our will recently, after everything that's happened. Your grandfather and I want to make sure our intentions are clear, that no one can misunderstand them. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief, because it seemed they were taking steps to safeguard their wishes. Anxiety, because it meant Mark's actions were clearly getting to them. That's a good idea, Grandma, I said carefully. I trust you both, but Mark seems to think he has a say in things. She nodded, her expression darkening. That's exactly why we did it, Caleb. We don't want him interfering. This is for you, and we won't let anyone take it away. After our conversation, I started to notice small changes around the house. A few documents were moved to a locked drawer, and my grandfather began keeping a safe in his office, a precaution he hadn't bothered with before. I didn't ask too many questions, not wanting to intrude, but I couldn't help but worry. It felt like they were preparing for something, an unseen battle to protect what was rightfully mine. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find an envelope in my mailbox. There was no return address, and my name was scrawled on the front in an unfamiliar hand. I opened it, my heart racing as I pulled out a typed letter. The message was short, but it made my stomach twist. Asterisk Caleb, be careful who you trust. Not everyone has your best interests at heart. A friend, asterisk. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Who would send me something like this? And what did they know that I didn't? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but a stronger, more paranoid part couldn't ignore the timing. It had to be about Mark. But who would have sent this? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed answers. I needed to know what Mark was planning before it was too late. I decided to dig around, starting with public records and any information I could find about Mark's finances. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I hoped to find something, anything, that might give me an edge. Over the next few nights, I stayed up late, scouring online databases, legal documents, anything that might give me insight into Mark's life. It didn't take long to discover that he was in debt, a lot of debt. Credit cards maxed out, a few business loans that had gone sour, and a suspicious amount of money funneled into some obscure investments. The pieces started falling into place. Mark wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. With this new information, I went to my grandparents. I felt they needed to know the full picture if they were going to protect themselves from him. When I told them what I'd found, Harold's face turned grim. Diane looked away, as though she couldn't bear to hear it. Caleb, we suspected he might have financial troubles, but this is worse than we thought, Harold said, shaking his head. It's clear now why he's so fixated on our money. The room fell silent as we all processed this grim reality. Harold put a hand on my shoulder. Thank you for telling us, Caleb. We'll take this into account moving forward. But please, be careful. Mark, he's unpredictable. And people do dangerous things when they're backed into a corner. A chill ran through me. It was one thing to know Mark was greedy. It was another to realize he might be willing to go to any lengths to get what he wanted. A few days later, Mark's behavior became even stranger. He'd started popping up unannounced at my apartment, asking about my grandparents, acting concerned in a way that felt more like an interrogation. One night, he showed up and hinted at needing some help from me financially. It was a pathetic attempt, honestly, to guilt me into giving him money. But when I refused, he dropped the friendly act. Fine, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But don't be surprised when people start questioning why you're so entitled to their money. I mean, you're not even their real son, Caleb. I felt my stomach lurch. Mark had never said anything like that before, and it stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. My grandparents were as close to parents as I'd ever had, and he knew that. Bringing up my background like that was a low blow, and it made me realize just how ruthless he was willing to be. The next day, I received a call from Harold. His voice was tense, and he asked me to come over right away. When I arrived, I found both of them waiting for me in the living room. Harold looked more serious than I'd ever seen him, and Diane seemed on the verge of tears. "We've discovered something troubling," Harold said, passing me a stack of papers. I glanced at them and realized they were documents, legal documents, that Mark had somehow gotten access to. He'd been pushing my grandparents to make him a co-trustee, giving him control over certain financial decisions. "We never agreed to it," Diane said, her voice trembling. "But he's been relentless, insisting it's for our protection, that he's only looking out for us." It was worse than I'd imagined. Mark wasn't just scheming for the inheritance. He was actively trying to worm his way into their finances, setting himself up to take control the moment anything happened to them. "We've consulted with our lawyer," Harold said, a firm resolve in his voice. "We're making sure he's kept out of anything involving our estate. We're also drafting additional documentation to make sure everything goes directly to you." I nodded, my heart pounding. That's good. That's really good. But what if he tries something else? "He's not going to take this lying down." Harold looked at me, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "We know, Caleb, but we're prepared to fight if we have to, and we're counting on you to help us." I could feel the responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders, but I was ready. Mark was playing dirty, and I knew I'd have to stay one step ahead of him if I was going to keep him from tearing apart my family. But even as I prepared to stand by my grandparents, I couldn't shake the sense that this was far from over. Sure enough, that night, Mark showed up at my door again. This time, he wasn't trying to hide his irritation. His face was red, his fists clenched, and he looked ready to explode. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat, stepping closer until he was right in my face. "Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, making things difficult for me. But you're making a big mistake, Caleb. You don't know who you're dealing with." I held my ground, staring him down even as my pulse raced. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Mark, and I'm not going to let you hurt them. Whatever you're planning, it stops here." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think they'll always take your side? People change. Loyalties shift. Don't think for a second that you're invincible." His words were almost a whisper, but the threat was clear. After he left, I locked the door, feeling a mix of anger and fear. He wasn't bluffing. I knew he had something else up his sleeve, and I had no idea what he might try next. As I sat there in the silence of my apartment, I realized that I couldn't rely solely on my grandparents' trust. I needed proof, something concrete to show exactly what kind of person Mark was, something that could shut down his schemes for good. And so, with a mix of dread and determination, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything I could about him, no matter where it led. I started digging into Mark's life with everything I had, and the more I uncovered, the more sickening the picture became. Mark's debt was far worse than I'd initially thought. He was thousands of dollars behind on loans, and creditors were circling. He'd even been served notices for debt collection, which he had tried to hide. The financial pressure on him was enormous, and it was obvious he viewed my grandparents' money as his last lifeline. Meanwhile, His tactics had become more aggressive. One evening, while I was over at my grandparents' house, he showed up with a large bouquet, playing the role of the doting son-in-law. But his smile was stretched too thin, his eyes darting between me and my grandparents like he was sizing us up. Harold, ever the gentleman, welcomed him politely, but I could see the strain on his face. Mark's performance continued through the evening, making a point to tell them, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about our family's future." He cast a glance in my direction that was anything but subtle. "It's important we make sure that everyone has a fair share in what's to come." It took every ounce of self-control not to call him out right there, but I knew that would only add fuel to his fire. I excused myself shortly after dinner, leaving Mark to his bonding time with them. The whole drive home, my mind was racing with a mixture of anger and frustration. Mark wasn't just circling, he was getting ready to strike. But I had a feeling that if I confronted him now, he'd find a way to twist it to his advantage. Then, the unthinkable happened. 2 days later, I woke up to several missed calls and texts from my grandparents, asking me to come over immediately. Heart pounding, I rushed to their house, praying that Mark hadn't done something drastic. When I arrived, Diane pulled me into the living room, her face as pale as I'd ever seen it. Harold sat nearby, his shoulders slumped, looking completely defeated. "We're so sorry, Caleb," Diane whispered, clutching my hand. "We don't know what to do." I tried to get them to explain, but it was clear they were too shaken to say much. After some coaxing, Harold finally pulled out a stack of papers and handed them to me. As I looked through them, I felt my blood run cold. It was a police report about me. According to the report, someone had accused me of attempting to forge documents related to my grandparents' estate. The accusation was that I'd tried to coerce them into handing over their money early, claiming it was due to their failing health. The language in the report was twisted, making it sound like I was preying on my grandparents, manipulating them to get my hands on their inheritance. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. This was Mark's doing. I was sure of it. He'd somehow planted this story, trying to frame me as the villain. I looked at my grandparents, my voice shaking. "You don't believe this, do you?" Diane's eyes filled with tears as she gripped my hands tighter. "Of course not, Caleb. We know you'd never do something like that. But Mark's been very persuasive lately. He's telling everyone he's just looking out for us." It felt like the floor was falling out from under me. This was exactly what he'd warned me about, that loyalties could shift, that people might not believe me. It was happening right before my eyes, and I had no way to prove he was behind it. "I don't know how he did this," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But Mark's trying to set me up. He wants to make it look like I'm the one after your money, so he can step in as the protector." Harold nodded slowly, but he looked exhausted. "We believe you, Caleb. But the fact that there's a report now, it complicates things. If anyone hears about this, it could ruin you. It could ruin us." It hit me then just how deeply Mark had thought this through. He wasn't just going after me. He was going after my relationship with my grandparents, trying to isolate me from the people I cared about the most. He knew if he could make me look like the bad guy, I'd lose any support I had. The worst part was, it was working. My grandparents were trying to be supportive, but I could see the doubt creeping in. I couldn't blame them. Mark had crafted his story so well, planting just enough suspicion to make them question everything. And without proof, I didn't stand a chance of convincing anyone otherwise. Desperate, I decided to reach out to the only other person I trusted, my best friend, Luke. We'd known each other since high school, and he'd always been my rock. When I explained the situation to him, he was as outraged as I was. "This guy's a psycho," he muttered, pacing my living room. "He's literally setting you up. You need to get something on him, something that shows he's lying." I agreed, but the problem was, Mark had been so careful. He'd avoided leaving any direct evidence, any paper trails that could lead back to him. Every attempt I'd made to expose him had fallen flat, and now he'd turned the tables on me. After some brainstorming, Luke suggested an idea that was risky but might be my only shot. What if we record him? Get him to admit what he's doing. At first, I was hesitant. Mark was smart, and he rarely let his guard down. But Luke convinced me it was worth a try. If I could catch him on tape, I'd have undeniable proof of his intentions. So, with a hidden recorder in my pocket, I went to see him. I showed up at Mark's house under the guise of wanting to talk things over. He greeted me with his usual fake smile, offering me a seat and acting as if nothing was wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mark, look," I began. "I don't want this tension between us. I think we both want what's best for my grandparents, right?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious but playing along. "Of course, Caleb. I'm only looking out for them." I leaned forward, keeping my tone casual. "But you and I both know that they've been generous with me, and that you've got your own interests. You don't have to hide it." For a moment, I thought he'd slip up, let something slip, but he just chuckled, shaking his head. "Caleb, I don't know what you're implying, but I've only ever acted in their best interests. Maybe it's you who's gotten a little overambitious." He was too slick, too careful. Frustrated, I pushed harder, hoping to provoke him. "I'm not the one who's drowning in debt, Mark. And I'm not the one who's pushing them to change their will." That did it. His face twisted, and for a brief second, I saw the mask slip. "Debt? You think that has anything to do with this?" "I deserve my share, Caleb. They owe me. I've been in this family just as long as you, and I've earned my right to it." He caught himself, snapping his mouth shut, but the damage was done. It wasn't a full confession, but it was something. I left his house, feeling a surge of relief. At least I had a piece of the puzzle, a hint of his entitlement that might show my grandparents what he was really after. But before I could share the recording with them, disaster struck. The very next day, my grandparents called me over in a panic. Apparently, someone had sent an anonymous letter claiming that I was pressuring them into giving me the money, even implying that I was dangerous. They didn't believe the accusation, but the fear it stirred in them was undeniable. Mark had outplayed me again, adding fuel to the fire just as I'd started gathering evidence against him. In the days that followed, I felt more isolated than ever. Mark had turned nearly everyone against me, using lies and manipulation to make it look like I was the threat. Even my mother had started avoiding my calls, likely influenced by whatever narrative Mark had fed her. I was losing control, and the walls were closing in. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Mark wasn't going to win. I was going to find a way to expose him, even if it meant risking everything. He might have trapped me in his web of lies, but I wasn't about to let him steal my family, my inheritance, or my future without a fight. This was only the beginning. I had no other choice. I had to make a final stand. Mark had nearly everyone believing his story, and even my grandparents, who had raised me and loved me, were beginning to falter under the pressure. He'd poisoned their trust with his lies, and I was out of options. The next day, I contacted an attorney, someone Luke's family knew well and trusted. I laid out everything for her, every underhanded tactic Mark had used and every piece of evidence I'd managed to collect, including the recording. Although it wasn't a direct confession, she believed it was enough to prove his intent. With her advice, I decided to take an even bolder step. That night, we arranged a family meeting, including my grandparents, Mark, my mother, and me, with the attorney present. Mark looked smug as he walked in, no doubt expecting to seal his victory. But the confidence slipped from his face when he saw the lawyer. "Thank you all for being here," she began, directing her gaze at each of us. "There have been serious accusations and attempts to manipulate this family's finances, and I'm here to ensure the truth comes to light." Mark tried to laugh it off, claiming that he was only looking out for my grandparents. But the lawyer didn't back down. She played the recording, letting his entitled rant echo through the room, and then presented his financial records, showing his mounting debts and history of suspicious activity. My grandparents sat silently, their faces pale with shock. "Is this what you've been hiding, Mark?" Harold asked, his voice breaking. For the first time, Mark looked genuinely afraid. He stammered, trying to deflect, but the evidence was undeniable. With his schemes laid bare, Mark's defense crumbled. My mother was shaken, realizing the truth about her husband, and my grandparents' trust in me was reaffirmed. They promised to take measures to secure their estate, ensuring Mark could no longer meddle in their affairs. In the end, I felt a bittersweet relief. Mark was finally out of our lives, but the scars he left would take time to heal. I'd fought to protect the people I loved, but at a cost I hadn't anticipated. Even so, I knew this struggle had strengthened my bond with my grandparents. We'd come through the fire together, and I was more determined than ever to honor their love and sacrifice.